Okay. Hello and welcome to episode 93 of Question and Answer. I am your host, Panyo Basa. And if I look a little pinker than usual, it's because I have a slight sunburn because my sweetheart and I celebrated our love for each other by renting a boat and spending the day on Lake Jacassi a couple days ago, where we drove around and looked at picturesque islands and waterfalls. And I found 63 cents lying under the water at one of the waterfalls. So it was sort of like a rebate on renting the boat. Also, I have the big exciting news that just yesterday, was it yesterday? Yeah, it was yesterday. My sweetheart and I went to a nursery, apparently run by like drug hippies, earth hippies on drugs. That'd be probably a better way of saying it. And I found this here particular plant, which is just, I mean, we got it just because it looks nice. It's like a really nice looking little plant, right? Look at that plant. But it turns out that it is Selaginella kraussiana, and it's just a weird plant because it's, it was said that it was a golden moss fern on the label, but it turns out that it's not a moss or a fern. It's like a missing link. It's like a transitional stage between mosses and ferns, and that members of this species or this genus have existed for more than 300 million years. I mean, this plant essentially existed before the dinosaurs, and it's one of the stages in the evolution of vascular land plants. So I'm all excited once I was reading up on Selaginella kraussiana. I was excited. And it turns out that when I was a kid, I had a different specimen of the same genus. It was a different species, but I got it when I was camping. It was at like this gift shop at this campground, and it was called a resurrection plant. And it was just in a plastic bag, this curled up fern-looking thing, all brown and dried out. But if you put it in water, it would turn green and resurrect and become alive again. And also, I read that the U.S. government has worked out a complete genome for probably not this same species, but a different species in this same genus of plant, just because it's considered to be so, I don't know, something. It's considered to be something like it's like a classic example of a certain plant genome. But with all that as kind of a preamble, I'm not even going to start on like complaining about the traffic. I've been like planning on complaining about traffic in South Carolina for several episodes, and I just never get around to it. I'm not going to get around to it this time either. So, we got a bunch of questions to answer, and I suppose I should start answering them. As my father used to say, a steady drop beats a hole in a rock. And so I should start dripping here. And the first question is from Mama. And Mama asked this question over the phone, and it came out in like a jumbled stream of consciousness kind of question, which is as follows. If you have a fortunate life and feel healthy, is it possible to escape from this life? Is it possible, if you live a good life, is it possible not to die with diseases or stuff, or is it inevitable? So I kind of streamlined it down. I kind of pared away the unnecessary stream of consciousness stuff. And it turns into this question. If you live a good life, is it possible not to die with diseases or stuff, or is it inevitable? So if you live a good life, can you just like die in your sleep, just kind of fade out painlessly without trauma? Or is a certain amount of disease and ickiness pretty much unavoidable? And I would say that if you have good karma, you live a good life, your chances of avoiding like real ickiness are increased. And that, your chances would be increased of simply dying in your sleep. Like my father's father, very mild mannered, cultured Baptist minister who, he was just a relatively wise, moral guy. He just died in his sleep. But on the other hand, Gautama Buddha himself he died with like a really icky intestinal disease. And sometimes you read that he died of dysentery. But recently, relatively recently, within the past year, I read an article that was like theorizing or hypothesizing that what the Buddha died of is a disease that is, I wouldn't say it's common to elderly people, but it's pretty much only elderly people that get it. It's a kind of like gangrene of the intestinal system, which is very painful, and it causes like bloody diarrhea and so forth. So, I mean, even the Buddha himself did not just fade out peacefully. Of course, Jesus of Nazareth died a particularly icky death also, assuming that he died. I mean, even if he was resurrected after he died, still, according to the Bible, he died. So, and then Mahamoggallana. We all know the story of Mahamoggallana, one of the two chief disciples of the Buddha, who was beaten to death, literally beaten to a pulp by jealous non-Buddhists, according to the story. So, yeah, I mean, your odds are increased, but you can't really control your karma. You don't really have any control over karma that is latent from like past existences and so forth. And so, yeah, I mean, living a good life is the best way to increase your odds of having a trouble-free life and a trouble-free death. But there are no guarantees because you really can't know exactly what your karma is because it's mainly subconscious. It's still like a mental state, but it's like subliminal. You know, it's below the level of consciousness of your ordinary waking ego. So I guess I answered that question. So I'm moving on to the next question, which is from Pope Kevin I. And Pope Kevin says, if insects don't produce karma, but they are reborn as insects because of the karma until they die, what if people don't have really conscious volition and free will, and we are born as humans as a result of karma and are stuck here, and from a cosmic perspective, we have the same level of volition as bugs? And the ancient Ajivaka religion in India, and there were Ajivakas in the Buddhist time, more Ajivakas than Buddhists in the Buddhist time. They believed something along these lines, that it's just strict determinism. You know, you don't have any control at all. But the Buddha said that was a wrong view. In fact, people who believe that stuff, who really take it seriously, they were in danger of going to hell. The Buddha says that in at least one sutta. But on the other hand, he pretty much shoots down free will too. Like in the Anattalakkhana Sutta, which is, according to tradition, the Buddha's second discourse after he became enlightened, which caused the enlightenment of his first disciples. He was saying that you cannot say with any of the five aggregates, the five khandhas that make up a human being, you cannot say with regard to any of them, let it be this way, let it not be that way, and reliably have it happen. Which pretty much says that we don't have complete control over our volitions. So that would at least very much reduce free will, since it's not totally free. So getting back to insects, though, if insects don't produce karma, but they are reborn as insects because of the karma until they die, well, personally, I'm not sure if insects are creating karma or not. But if insects aren't creating karma or not, they're not really conscious beings. You know, they wouldn't exist on their own. They wouldn't have like an individual self-existence the way humans apparently have, or even like a dog apparently has. But according to Buddhism, like strict Orthodox Buddhism, even insects have mental states. And so insects are creating karma. And so I'm not sure if they do. I'm not sure that insects really have volition and perceptions. I really don't think an insect has enough consciousness to have sort of like an internal mental image of what's going on. So maybe as a kind of compromise between myself and strict orthodoxy, we could say that an insect has like this tiny speck of consciousness that somehow produces tiny specks of volition, which is karma. So that insect is creating very low level, like a primordial speck like karma that gives it a kind of primordial speck like individual existence. But that's generally not the case with humans, that we are pretty obviously conscious. We've got much larger minds than insects do, and there's a lot more room for stuff in our mind, including preferences and volitions and desires and all this kind of thing. So I really am not a strict determinist. There is a certain amount of, like, even in science now, you know, there's like quantum randomness. And I've read a book that was talking about, I mean, the guy who wrote the book was trying to come up with some scientifically plausible explanation for free will. And he was saying that just the events going on in our neurotransmitters, you know, like the threshold of stimulation for a nerve, whether it's going to fire or not, you know, the difference between firing and not firing is so tiny that it's at a quantum level of randomness. And so Dr. Schwartz, who wrote the book, was saying that, you know, that's where your spirit or soul or volition or whatever is influencing the physical system of whether the nerve fires or not, which then causes this whole stream of, you know, perception or volition or whatever. But insects, they've got very few neurons, very few nerve cells compared to us. And so, I mean, we're just orders of magnitude beyond an insect. And I really do not think that we are just complex meat robots. Although a lot of scientists, apparently including like Stephen Hawking, believe that we were just, you know, slaves to determinism. But according to him, the math was so complicated that you couldn't really predict the future, even though it was strictly deterministic, just because it was so hard to do the math that it was just impossible for humans. So I don't know if I answered Pope Kevin's question here, but I suppose I should just move on. I mean, the official Orthodox Buddhist answer to Pope Kevin's question would be that insects and humans produce karma, although it's at different levels, obviously. So I'm just going on to the next question, which is from Mooners. Maybe I should move the microphone away from my mouth a little bit because I've noticed that when I make P sounds, for example, it causes like this distortion in the microphone. So anyways, Mooner says, where can I learn Burmese? And one person left a reply to his comment under the YouTube video saying Burma, which of course would be the best place to learn Burmese. If you really want to learn Burmese, go to Burma and learn it there, preferably from like an educated city person, like in Mandalay. Mandalay has a reputation for having like the purest traditional Burmese, like grammar and pronunciation and all that. Although I learned Burmese partly from a book that was published by Yale University Press. This was like probably back in the 1960s or 70s. So you can find books on how to speak Burmese, but it's going to be way easier to learn it well if you've got a Burmese speaking person teaching you. I mean, it's pretty much the only way to learn how to speak Burmese well enough that a Burmese person could actually understand what you're saying or trying to say is if you have a Burmese person with Burmese pronunciation teaching you how to speak Burmese. because the pronunciation is the hardest part of Burmese. It's like vocabulary wise, it's fairly simple. It has few, if any, irregular verbs or irregular adjectives. You know, like in English, you've got good, better, best. In Burmese, you just have good, more good, most good. Good, gooder, goodest, pretty much in Burmese. But it's the pronunciation is difficult. It's very tricky because there are differentiations between sounds that do not exist in English, for example. So, yeah, I mean, pretty much the only place or only way that you could learn Burmese reliably would be from a native Burmese speaker or one of those philological savants who can just learn to speak a language fluently, even though they weren't born into the language. But having the book by Yale University Press does help because it does explain things in a systematic way that Westerners can understand easily. So, I mean, they do have those things that they advertise on the radio now, like Babbel, and there's a few other ones. I don't know if they would bother to teach Burmese because, I mean, it's not a high demand language like Spanish or French, but that would be a possibility too, maybe. Just finding some like a site on a computer or something that teaches languages, and there might be recordings of proper pronunciations and so forth. So, I guess I answered that question. So I move on to Bodhisattva 969, alias Mara Maid Mahayana. And I will point out that Bodhisattva 969 asked the transgressive fourth question because we are supposed to keep it limited to 3 questions. But curiosity is a virtue, I think. And we won't punish him too severely. So, Bodhisattva 969's first question is, should one primarily support the Dhammayuttika orders as the most serious successors to the Buddha's teachings? As far as I know, these or similar ones also exist in Burma. The Buddha himself spoke of the high merit to support monks who live according to the Buddha's teachings. So there is no Dhammayuttika order in Burma, or if there is, it's just it's like a fringe gyne. They're called gynes in Burmese. Although the Hmong order from which the Dhammayuttika order of Thailand arose still exists in Burma, but there are relatively few followers of that also. In Burma, the 2 main orders are Thudama and Shweijin. Those are the 2 main ones. Most Buddhist monks in Burma belong to either Thudama or Shweijin. Pretty much like in Thailand, the monks belong to Mahanikaya or Dhammayut. And Shweijin is considered to be the stricter of the 2 gynes in Burma. But there are this totally shameless, immoral, not Dhammayut monks, but Shweijin monks in Burma. So if you're going to support monks that are the most serious followers of the Buddha's teachings, I would go on an individual basis. Individual monk, or go monastery by monastery. Some monasteries are stricter than other monasteries, and there may be monks from some sect or gyne, as it's called in Burmese, that it's traditionally not as strict in following Vinaya or Dhamma, but nevertheless, certain individuals, certain monasteries can be very strict. And it's that way in Burma. Like the Thudama gyne is considered in general not to be as strict as Shweijin, but still there are a lot of Thudama monks who are much stricter in their practice than a lot of Shweijin monks. So you're better off just like looking at individual monks or looking at the behavior of monks at individual monasteries and using your discrimination in that way rather than just go with statistics and support Dhammayut or Shweijin monks just because statistically they are somewhat stricter in their practice. In Thailand, I think there's more to back up the idea that Dhammayut monks are more strict than the Mahanikaya monks. But in Burma, there's really not that much of a difference between the 2. So, yeah, I would just like, if you're going to discriminate and want to support the stricter monks and support the less stricter monks, then yeah, I'd just go with individual monks. You observe their behavior, or at a larger scale, individual monasteries, and that would probably be as far as I would go with it. So I'm just going to move on to Bodhisattva 969's next question here, which is, which of the 5 contemplations do you personally consider to be the most effective, and how should one practice this? Well, I'm never really practiced the 5 contemplations very much, and I may be even wrong in repeating what the 5 contemplations are, but there's contemplation of one's own merit or one's own morality. There's contemplation of the devas, contemplation of the virtues of the Buddha. I guess there's contemplation of the virtues of the Dhamma and the Sangha. So that might be the 5. And then, but also there's like contemplation of death, contemplation of the repulsiveness of food, and so forth. So I'm not exactly sure which 5 contemplations he's referring to. But, contemplations on the virtues of Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, usually it takes the form of just reciting a kind of mantra over and over and over again, like Burmese Buddhists who use mala beads, like a Buddhist rosary, will often go through the the virtues of the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, which are 9, 6, and 9. 9 virtues of the Buddha, 6 virtues of Dhamma, 9 virtues of the Sangha. And it's just a Pali formula that I won't recite now. And considering one's own morality, that is recommended especially when you're on your deathbed. Then you can like rejoice over your own virtue to some degree, just to keep you from worrying, having a negative mental state at the moment of death, because your mental state at the moment of death is possibly the most important mental state of your life. So, on the other hand, just sitting around thinking about how wonderful your behavior is all the time, it can lead to, like being conceited and stuck up and so forth. So, contemplation of the devas, it is in the standard list of 40 meditation methods in the Visuddhimagga, but we really can't understand the devas very well. It's sort of like dogs contemplating humans. Dogs know more about humans than we know about devas, because they can just sit there while they're scratching themselves, observing our behavior. They hear the refrigerator door open, they come running. With humans and devas, it's not like that, possibly because devas don't even have refrigerator doors. So, the contemplation of death, which might not be on the list of 5 that he was referring to, but that's the one that I've probably practiced the most, aside from just chanting the formula, which sometimes you're not even thinking about the meaning of it. You just memorize the words and it just comes out your mouth. But contemplation of death, Marananusati, recollection of death, that was the one that I practiced the most, and it had the most positive effect in my Dhamma practice, just because you're reminding yourself that you're not going to live forever. I had a skeleton with the bones all connected and articulated that a supporter got for me from a medical college in Burma. And I would just have it sitting in meditative posture outside my cave. And sometimes you just look at it and think, as that was, so am I. And as that is, so will I become. You just kind of remind yourself on a regular basis that you're not going to live forever. And that might be seen as morbid by a lot of people who just don't want to think about that kind of stuff at all, but it prepares you better. When the time for you to go finally arrives, you will be better prepared for it, because you've been sort of mentally preparing for years and years. So, and also it just encourages you to have what is called samvega, or a sense of spiritual urgency and not want to waste time. Why just sit around watching TV or playing video games when you're not necessarily any better off after doing this activity for 2 or 3 hours or all day. It's just kind of, it kills time, but you're not really any better off after than you were before. So I hope I answered that question, because I'm moving on to the next one, which is kind of a strange one. Bodhisattva 969 says, I'm thinking about reading the book Yogi Hitler, written by a yoga teacher. The description of the book states, quote, Arthur Schopenhauer, Friedrich Nietzsche, Richard Wagner, Dietrich Eckart, Houston St. Chamberlain, and Madison Grant played a significant role in shaping the ideology of National Socialism. They were all familiar with yoga and Buddhism, had sympathies for certain approaches to Indian philosophy, and reflected this in their writings. The question of what influence and what effect yoga and Indian thought had on the decisions of leading National Socialists is answered in depth in this book, unquote. And then Bodhisattva 969 continues with, what do you think of this description, and would you agree with it? Well, to what extent Schopenhauer influenced the German Nazi Party of like the 1920s, 30s, and first half of the 40s, I really don't know. Nietzsche probably had more of an influence. Wagner had an influence on Hitler especially, although to what extent Wagner was into like Buddhism or Dharma or Indian philosophy, I have no idea. And with regard to Dietrich Eckart, Houston St. Chamberlain, and Madison Grant, I don't even know who they are exactly. But I would say that I have read about Adolf Hitler in a number of books, some serious books that weren't just like propagandizing and demonizing him. Just they were portraying him as a product of the times and as a politician who was very successful at first and then became extremely unsuccessful at the very end. And it just seems to me that Hitler really did not have much interest in Eastern philosophy or Buddhism. He was more of the Muslim type. He wanted some like militaristic or at least non-pacifistic approach to spirituality, as far as I can tell. I mean, he did not seem like a particularly spiritual person. I guess who was Himmler had some interest in occultism and so forth. But for the most part, I assume that the leaders of the National Socialist movement in Germany were more interested in political and sociological issues, not so much in spiritual issues. If they were coming up with any kind of spirituality, it was for political and sociological purposes, trying to get the people united in their worldview behind National Socialism by using such and such ideology. But yeah, from what I know about Hitler, and I know more about Hitler than most people, although I'm certainly no authority on the man, he just did not strike me as particularly spiritual. In fact, none of his top, underlings, like Himmler or, oh gosh, Rudolf Hess, or, man, I'm having mental blocks with regard to my Nazis, I guess. What was the World War I fighter ace who was like, starts with Goring. Yeah, Hermann Goring. I mean, he was not a spiritual person. And then the propaganda guy, gosh, Goebbels. I mean, you can read their diaries and so forth, and they're really not preoccupied with spiritual matters. So I think that probably this book is trying to milk as much of the theory as they can to sell books. Maybe the guy really believes that like yoga, Indian philosophy had really an influential effect on National Socialism and so forth. But it seems kind of far-fetched to me. I mean, I don't know. Maybe if I read the book, I'd think, wow, there's really something to this. But it's kind of sounds like a Graham Hancock kind of approach to National Socialism. if you understand what I'm talking about with Graham Hancock, where, he has his pet theories and he'll do everything he can to support those theories. And if he's cornered, he may have to admit that there's no real evidence for them, but still, it's possible. So it'd be something like that, I assume. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here, which is, what do you think about supporting you and your channel through channel membership? Then you could give channel members also small advantages. Channel membership, I'm not even sure exactly what channel membership is on YouTube. No, I've seen some channels do offer it as an option. And then it kind of unlocks videos that other people can't see, may give them certain other advantages. My approach at present has been just having Subscribestar as an option. If anyone wants to support me financially, they can subscribe to me on Subscribestar and offer as little as $5 a month. I mean, you can even join the Subscribestar thing for free, because I don't really like the idea of charging money for Dhamma, So, and I mean, originally I was a monk, so I definitely wasn't charging money for anything back when I was a monk. So it is a possible, maybe somebody could talk me into it. Some good salesman could talk me into it, I suppose. Yeah. But I mean, if you do want to contribute to the cause, you're very welcome to, and your generosity is appreciated. But I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from SG. And SG says, if one can share merit with relatives, and I know some share merit with everyone else, wouldn't the merit of all the Buddhas, Devas, and liberated beings, since they have attained the deathless and would no doubt share it with all their metta, be so large and universal that it could be considered a form of grace that suppresses our bad karma by, I imagine, quite a bit, and maybe even give liberation to some who are more receptive to it? Okay, so this question is all about sharing merit, and it's kind of a big deal in Theravada Buddhism. I'm not sure about other schools of Buddhism, but like in Burma, after the Burmese people will they'll hear a Dhamma talk, and they'll take the three refuges and the 5 precepts or the 8 precepts after that, or they make a donation to the monastery, make the donation to a monk. They'll share their merit, which starts out with them saying, Ahmya, Ahmya, Ahmya. That indicates, if you hear a Burmese person saying, Ahmya, 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 that means they're commencing to share merit. But the thing is, you don't really share merit. You cannot share your own merit with another person. Not directly, anyway. The orthodox Burmese explanation of sharing merit is that you share merit, and anyone who can hear you sharing merit, anyone who has observed you doing something meritorious, they will rejoice at your act of merit. They'll have what is called mudita. They'll feel happy over your well-being, and that will then be good karma for them. So it's not like the merit is actually shared from one person to the next. It's just that one person does something meritorious and is willing to share that merit, at least figuratively. And then anyone who is aware of that and rejoices, they're glad that this person did something meritorious and wants to share that merit, then their gladness is itself meritorious. So it's sort of spreading through contagion in a way. I had one teacher who compared sharing merit to using one candle to light another candle, but I don't think that's the best possible example. One of the main ways of sharing merit is at a funeral, or at the Burmese, periodically after a relative dies or a loved one dies, they'll go to the monastery and make offerings on behalf of that person for their benefit. And the only way it can really work is if the deceased person is essentially a kind of ghost or a lower deva who is able to hear what's going on, who has any interest in what's going on the dirt ball of earth, and is present or present enough that they can know what's going on. And then they rejoice that their surviving relatives are doing this on their behalf. And then that rejoicing is itself the meritorious deed that in a way shares merit to them. But it's their own mental states. And it's not somebody else's mental states or somebody else's karma that's spreading into another person. It's just that, as I explained, one person does something meritorious and they want to share the merit. And then another being is aware of that and rejoices at that. That rejoicing is in a way giving them a kind of imitation of the merit that the first person wants to share. So any number of, put my elbows on the table and it shakes everything. So any number of enlightened beings can exist in this on this world, and they can't really share their merit, but they do kind of raise the level of consciousness of the entire planet in a way. So I mean, they do help us in that way. Just to live in a world that has enlightened beings and teachings of enlightened beings is a better world than a world that doesn't have that. And I have mentioned that St. John of the Cross has said in one of his books that you have two people. One person is just, tending to the sick and feeding the hungry and clothing the people that don't have enough clothes and giving homes to the homeless and just doing all this meritorious stuff. And another person is sitting alone in a cell practicing deep contemplation, which a Buddhist would call jhana. And that of these two people, the second one, the one who's sitting alone in a cell practicing jhana, is actually helping the world more than the first person. Because the first person is essentially putting band-aids on symptoms and not really getting to the heart of the problem, which is deep down inside. Whereas the person who is practicing jhana in solitude is in a way raising the level of consciousness, like the general level of consciousness of the whole planet to some degree. So I think I answered that question. And even if I didn't, I'm moving on to the next one anyway. And this is from Rui. And Rui says, what is your take on the faculty of imagination from a dharmic perspective? And I assume there are suttas that talk about imagination, but it seems to me that the ancient Indian approach, like as is found in the Pali text, was not a very sophisticated explanation, and not as sophisticated as somebody like David Hume. And so, like, if I'm trying to understand the faculty of imagination, I rely more on like early modern Western philosophers like David Hume than I do on something like traditional Theravadan orthodoxy. And David Hume was saying that the faculty of imagination is sort of recombining like already acquired perceptions. Like you can't imagine anything that has elements of it that is completely foreign to any experience you've ever had. Like you can't imagine a color you've never seen. Excuse me, I got something in my throat besides orange juice. So what imagination is you take, like bits and pieces of things that you've already perceived, like supposedly in the outside world, and then you can recombine them in accordance with your imagination. So that is pretty much the way I understand the faculty of imagination, not so much from a Dhammic perspective, although I don't think that really is contrary to Dhamma. I don't think that David Hume's explanation of how imagination works would really be like pernicious wrong view from the Buddhist point of view. I do think that that does make sense. It's just recombining previously perceived perceptions, or at least aspects of things you've already perceived before, and recombining them in accordance with feelings and intuition and so forth. Although I certainly don't want to have to define intuition, but genuine intuition would be like a liminal state. It's like you're getting out into, almost into the void, like primordial chaos. It's like like a little window in your mind opens up to the primordial chaos and is able to filter things that seem acceptable, and weeding out just the spam and so forth. So there would be some of that also in genuine imagination, something beyond what a computer could do, I assume, at present anyway. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Ram Das EFX. And Ram Das EFX says, do you know anything about actual freedom, occasionally referred to as actualism? This is some type of contemplative practice that was said to have been invented accidentally not long ago by, if I recall correctly, an Australian. I heard about it because Daniel Ingram was talking about it 10 to 15 years ago. He said that actual freedom produces a different kind of awakening that is opposite in some ways to the awakening experienced by Buddhist arahants. Well, it could be like because they're in Australia, they're like in the southern hemisphere, and it'd be like the opposite of, I don't know. Yeah, actually, I'd never heard of actual freedom before. And I even looked for it on Wikipedia, just to get the little info McNugget, just so I'd have just a general idea of what it was. And there's not even an article about it, at least not under actual freedom on Wikipedia. The closest I came to was, it was talking about Marxism, how Lenin said that, capitalism can produce a kind of conditional freedom, but not actual freedom that like the full fruition of communism would produce. But I don't think that he was talking about communism. And I don't think that Marxists really know what they're talking about when they talk about freedom anyway. So, yeah, I don't know anything about actual freedom other than what Ram Das EFX has included in this question. That includes my sum total of knowledge about actual freedom. So I suppose in order not to embarrass myself, I should just move on to Ram Das EFX's next question, which is kind of a strange one. Are there any rules against gouging someone's eyes out on the condition that they are a criminal or disagree with you politically? In the Vinaya, I mean. And then he continues with, this was famously a punishment that was used in Tibet until it was abolished by the 13th Dalai Lama in the early 20th century. I believe that sort of thing was done there basically as an alternative to the death penalty, which was seen as un-Buddhist. So in the previous Q&A, the same person here, with possibly a different name, because he changes his name kind of a lot, was asking about whether it's against Vinaya for a monk to become like a king of a theocratic nation like the Dalai Lama. I mean, he was mainly had the Dalai Lama in mind. And now, I guess, in Tibet, it was a punishment to gouge somebody's eyes out for committing certain serious crimes, like felonies or something. And ironically, according to the rules of monastic discipline, it would be only a minor transgression if done to a layperson. If a monk like seriously like beats up or injures another monk, that's a pachidiya offense, which requires expiation. He has to make confession, and then at least the ecclesiastical transgression is rectified. But for a layperson, it's only a dukkha offense, which is the mildest level of offense. And I assume punching them in the nose and giving them a nosebleed or gouging their eyes out would be similar, so long as they survive. You haven't killed them. But I do think that there are certain commentarial additions to that rule, saying that, for example, if you hurt somebody and they have to go to a doctor and pay the doctor, then you are responsible for their loss of money by hurting them. And then the monk would be responsible and have to somehow like rectify that situation, or else he could get into big trouble. Possibly even, I mean, theoretically, maybe somehow even be excommunicated for depriving that person of their own wealth. But yeah, this is another one of those cases where the ancient rules of monastic discipline just did not foresee monks going around gouging other people's eyes out. It was just, there was not seen to be a need to make a rule against it, because nobody figured any monk was going to do that. And it may be that in ancient India, you just gouge somebody's eyes out, there's a good chance they're going to die anyway. If they do die, like from like an infection or something afterwards, then the person will be guilty of murder. Although I am reminded of reading, I think it was in Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, about how Byzantine Christians, when they would blind somebody, usually it was like a political opponent, somebody who had some potential to become the next emperor, but the current emperor didn't want that person to become the next emperor, and so they would be blinded. And at first they would gouge their eyes out, and then they came up with this method that was considered to be more humane and more Christian, where they would just shine really bright light, or it was like holding some kind of like hot, like, I can't even remember what it was now. It's not the sort of thing that I study up on much, but it was like red hot iron or something, maybe what they were using at first. And then they started using like mirrors or something to just blind the person by just burning out their retina without going to the trouble and inconvenience of gouging their eyes out. But yeah, that would be definitely undharmic. It would certainly be against Dhamma to gouge somebody's eyes out, even if you could find some loophole in the rules. I think I've mentioned before that in Burma, there is a little saying among monks. It's we need that, chet that, which means if you're skillful at the rules of monastic discipline, you can kill a chicken because you know all the loopholes. You know all the ways of avoiding rules that you don't want to follow. And it may be that some Buddhist government could justify blinding people as a humane way of not killing them. But for monks to do it, it'd probably be best kind of to take the attitude of the Spanish Inquisition, where the Spanish Inquisition would find someone guilty, and then they just hand them over to the secular authorities. And the secular authorities would be the ones who were like burning them at the stake and so forth. I mean, the priests would still be there, chanting their prayers and so forth. But they would sentence, they would find the person guilty and then just hand them over to someone who was not a monk or a priest, and then they do all the dirty work, which probably, in a Buddhist theocracy, something like that would probably arise if necessary. But I'm just moving on to the next question here. This is from Ram Das EFX again. And he did not ask this question in the Q&A room, but he did ask a question, and it's fair game. So he asks, what does objective and subjective mean? What is the difference between a subjective claim versus an objective claim? And I do consider pure objectivity to be a myth, that pure objectivity does not exist, even with regard to observing stuff in the outside world. Even in quantum physics, in modern science, they're saying that the observer does have an effect on what is observed. So there's always going to be a certain subjective influence. And if you're an idealist, like a Yogacara Mahayana Buddhist, then objective, it would be more of an attitude than a real difference, I think. So anyways, I looked it up in the dictionary. I looked up objective in my dictionary, and it says objective, adjective. And then the main definition at question here is of a person or their judgment not influenced by personal feelings or opinions in considering and representing facts, contrasted with subjective. So subjective presumably would mean that you are influenced by personal feelings or opinions in considering and representing facts. So, but I mean, I don't think there is any pure objectivity. So you can become more objective, though. For example, if you're practicing mindfulness, that if anger arises, for example, then if you have a subjective approach, it's just, I'm pissed off. But if you have a more objective approach, then you observe the anger as though you're an ichthyologist observing a specimen of a fish. And I mean, it's just anger is arising. You're not identifying with it. So you can be more objective, but I don't think pure objectivity really exists in reality, in human psychology anyway. And I don't know if he was even expecting an answer to that question, considering he did not ask it in the Q&A room. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Siovach and Sipad Zidana. And Siovach and Sipad Zidana asks, how did you learn Pali well enough to translate texts? Well, as a junior monk, I had to study Pali. My teacher, Utesaniya, was my teacher, and we used the new Pali course by, I think his name was like Buddha Datta or something. It was by a Sinhalese monk. He wrote the new Pali course in 3 volumes, and we went through the first 2 volumes. And after that, I knew enough that if I had a Pali English dictionary handy, I could read Pali text, especially relatively simple stuff. Like, fortunately for me, the rules of monastic discipline are in fairly straightforward prose, and it's relatively easy to read. And suttas are relatively easy to read, especially if you avoid poetry. But you get into the commentaries and Abhidhamma and so forth, it starts getting more scholastic and complicated and harder to read. And poetry is harder to read. But you just keep doing that. I mean, you just keep reading and reading. And, you consult a Pali grammar in case you come across some weird verb form that you're not familiar with. Or you look in the dictionary if you come across some word you don't know the meaning of. And you just keep doing that until you're relatively good at it. And then, in my case, the Atthakavagga of the Sutta Nipata was my favorite text, my favorite group of texts. And I just was not satisfied with the translations that existed at the time. The main translation that I had, and I think I still have it on the bookcase back there, was by K.R. Norman for the Pali Text Society, who was a linguist, a philologist, who really didn't care about Buddhism or Buddhist philosophy, didn't care about Dharma much. He was just interested in, like, Prakrit languages. And then that version of his translation of the Sutta Nipata also had alternate translations or alternate renderings by Walpola Rahula and I.B. Horner. So most of the Sutta Nipata, including the Atthakavagga, is pretty straightforward. It's like everyone agrees on the meanings of most of it. But when there was differences of opinion, you'd have like various, alternate renderings of the same passage. But still, I just wasn't satisfied with it. So I embarked on a rather long, difficult process of making my own translation of the Atthakavagga and just studying up on it and reading all sorts of things about it and trying to come up with as good of an English translation, mainly for my own use, as I could. So that was part of my learning process, is just translating itself. But I had done a lot of Pali reading and studying before then. So I'm just going to move on to Siovach and Sipad Zidana's next question here, which is, can you please do an analysis of Anguttara Nikaya 11.9? I've heard people say the Buddha is going against mantra meditation and concentration meditations here. What do you think is the lesson of the sutta? Well, the sutta says that, you shouldn't have any kind of meditative object. It starts with, earth, water, wind, and fire, the four elements, the four great elements. And I mean, in other suttas, that is just given as just the standard example for any meditative objects that are below the level of jhana. And then you're not supposed to do jhana meditation with, like the formless jhanas. You're not supposed to have any of the formless jhanas as your object of meditation. And it's saying that, if you're really wise, then you go beyond having this perceptual object that you're focusing your attention on. And it does say that, like an enlightened being, the gods themselves who can read minds still don't know what your object of meditation is when you're sitting in meditation, if you're like an enlightened being, like the Buddha himself. So it's saying that you shouldn't have any object of meditation, which is going back to like the Atthaka Vagga, even though this is from the 11th chapter of the Anguttara Nikaya, the chapter of 11s, which according to G.C. Pandey probably was a late addition, that the odds of a sutta in Anguttara 11 being really ancient are pretty low. But even so, this is sort of standard Buddhism that's sort of hearkening back to the early times, where it's just saying you should not have any object of meditation. And that would include mindfulness also. Because if you're being mindful of doing walking meditation, then that's like your object is whatever is arising when you're doing walking meditation. So yeah, it's not really going against mantra meditation and concentration meditation so much as it's just going against having any kind of perceptual object, which would include what is vulgarly known as vipassana meditation also. Because even in vipassana meditation, you've got like the in and out breath as your object of meditation, or whatever kind of experiences you're having, that's your object of meditation. And it seems to me that the main point of Anguttara Nikaya 11.9 is that once you get to a certain level, once you get like enlightened or damn close to enlightenment, you're not going to have an object of meditation anymore. It's just going to be, you've cultivated the signless, essentially. So I guess that is the main lesson of the sutta, is that eventually you have to let go of all objects of meditation, all perceptual objects, which is just a standard theme of the Atthaka Vagga of the Sutta Nipata. So I'm just going to move on to Siyovakshin Sipat Zidana's next question, which is top 10 favorite Mahayana sutras, shastras, etc. And I've never really made a list of my top 10 favorite Mahayana texts, but I did just for the sake of answering this question. So let's see, the Diamond Cutter Sutra, the Heart Sutra. I guess there's two Heart Sutras, but one is just a little more elaborate than the other. Then there's Nagarjuna's Mula Majjhimaka Karika. That's classic. The Tibetan Book of the Great Liberation, which is one of the most profound books I've ever read. The Heikigan Roku, or the Blue Cliff Record, I like very much. It's more hard to understand than the Mumonkan, which is the next one on the list. It's the Heikigan Roku and the Mumonkan are both collections of Zen koans. And the compiler who wrote the Blue Cliff Record, or the Heikigan Roku, he was more far out than Mumon was. Because, I mean, his poetry is just bizarre. I mean, it's just deliberately confusing. It's like he's just deliberately yanking the rug out from under you over and over and over again. But if you're trying not to cling to perceptual constructs, like Anguttara 11.9 advises us to do, then it's good to have a certain amount of disorientation flung at you from a wise teacher, to have the rug pulled out from under you over and over again so that you have no firm ground beneath your feet. So let's see, also, I guess this could be considered Mahayana texts is just alternative patimokkha's or pratimokshas. This, like the list of rules for monks to follow. I did read a book once that had a number of pratimokshas that translated into English. It was like 8 or 12 different versions of the pratimokshas, and all of them except the Pali version were taken from Mahayana, like they were translated from Chinese or Tibetan, from the Mahayana Tripitakas there in China or Tibet. So, yeah, that would be on my list of the top 10, I guess, just for my own interest in like the evolution of Vinaya rules and so forth. Then there was Milarepa's autobiography, which was very interesting. The Tibetan Book of the Dead I might as well throw in because it's hard to come up with a list of 10 favorite Mahayana texts. And maybe the Lotus Sutra, just because it's so important for Mahayana Buddhism. It helps you to understand Mahayana Buddhism better. And it's a strange kind of amalgamation of earlier Buddhist thought and like the new Mahayanist thought when the Lotus Sutra was combined. Or when the Lotus Sutra was composed, I should say. So, my top 10 just that I came up with, and may not be 100% accurate because I may be just forgetting some really good texts that I should include. But the Diamond Cutter Sutra, the Vajra Chedika Prajna Paramita Sutra, the Heart Sutra, the Mula Majjhimaka Karika, the Tibetan Book of the Great Liberation, also known as the Yoga of Knowing the Mind in Its Nakedness, attributed to Padmasambhava, the Heikigan Roku, or the Blue Cliff Record, Zen Koans, the Mumon Kan, or No Gate Barrier, also Zen Koans, the Alternative Pratimoksha's, Milarepa's autobiography, Tibetan Book of the Dead, and the Lotus Sutra. And I'm moving on to the next question now. This is from Lieberlam. And Lieberlam surprisingly asks a question that's quite easy to understand. Because usually he asks these very cerebral, elaborate kind of questions that are hard for me to grasp sometimes. But this one I can grasp, which is as follows. If you were to separate what each means for you, would you say that you are more of a samatha or vipassana guy? So, mainly, do I lean more towards samatha or vipassana, or like concentration meditation or mindfulness meditation? I really do not like the term vipassana with regard to a meditation technique or a movement, because it's really not a meditation technique. I guess it's kind of a movement in the West, especially. Or, I mean, considering the Mahasi method was vipassana, yeah, also in Burma and elsewhere. But still, vipassana isn't something that you do. It's insight that arises spontaneously, and it can arise spontaneously after practicing samatha meditation. So let's just go with concentration meditation, like meditation that emphasizes samadhi or concentration, and then like mindfulness meditation or meditation that emphasizes sati or mindfulness. And I've used to think about this a lot, like the difference between the two. And it's sort of like the two ways of digging a basement. So there's two ways you can dig a basement. You can just dig it down in one place and then expand outwards. Or you can just dig it down just level by level. The whole basement gradually gets deeper. That would be the second way. So the first way is you dig a deep hole as deep as you want it and then expand outwards. That would be similar to samatha meditation. Whereas digging the entire basement area just down level by level, that would be more of the mindfulness way of meditation. Or, well, I want to get into that. So it's like if you're meditating with samatha, you are stilling like one part of your mind. You're just eliminating distractions and so forth from one part of your mind, this concentrated, attentive part of your mind. And then gradually that spreads out into other areas of your personality. And this works best for people who have like a compartmentalized personality. There's a lot of people, like New Age people tend to be this way, where your mind is compartmentalized. And if you meditate, you can be a really good meditator. You can sit there like a statue for 3 hours straight. But then when you get back up again, you're just as messed up as you were before. Because it's just this one compartment of your mind that's kind of separated from the rest of your mind that gets really good at meditating. but it doesn't have much effect on the other parts of your mind. So you have to start with that and then gradually spread it out to the other areas of your mind. Whereas mindfulness is more for people that do not have a very compartmentalized mind. It's like when you meditate, you got to bring your entire personality into the meditation, because you can't just separate out the parts that you don't want there. You just don't go into religion mode or meditation mode. It's like you're in the same general frame of mind as you are at any other time, because you've got to take your entire psyche with you when you meditate. And that's more the kind of person I am. My mind is pretty well integrated. I don't have like these separated compartments in my mind the way a lot of people do. There was this one guy I knew, he was a doctor in Burma, a very compartmentalized mind, that he would adopt like a different tone of voice. If he'd talk about religion, he'd almost get into this chanty sing-song kind of voice, like a televangelist. They can't speak normally when they're talking about Jesus. They have like this compartment, the special Jesus compartment in their mind where they act differently. They speak differently. But with me, if I'm talking about Dhamma, it's pretty much the same as I'm talking about anything else. And when I'm meditating, my mind is really not so different than it is at other times, because I've got to bring my whole mind with me, because I just do not have a special meditation compartment in my mind. So just by like temperament, I'm more of a vipassana guy, because my mind just isn't very compartmentalized. And I was going to say earlier that another way of looking at the difference between samatha and vipassana is with regard to breeding a white cocker spaniel. My father used to breed dogs long before I was born. He had a kennel. And at the time, this is like maybe the 1950s, there did not yet exist a pure white cocker spaniel. They had sort of cream-colored cocker spaniels, and they had white cocker spaniels with darker spots. And so my father had to think, which way do you breed a white cocker spaniel? Because the first person to breed a white cocker spaniel is going to make a lot of money. So there's two ways you could do it. You just get paler and paler cream-colored ones until you get down to white, or you get the ones with spots and you just breed fewer and smaller spots, the white ones with fewer and smaller, darker spots, to get to white that way. And so just starting off with paler and paler cream color, that would be more like vipassana. It's like you're changing the entire color of the dog gradually through the process. Whereas with regard to going for the smaller and fewer spots, it's like you've already got some white, but you're just trying to get more and more white. If that makes any sense. I could have just wasted the last several minutes talking about basements and cocker spaniels. But it does help you if you know what kind of personality you have. It can help you in knowing what the best kind of meditation for you would be. For if you're a good hypnotic subject, or like if you're reading a book and you're just oblivious to anything going on around you, you get so absorbed into this book, it may be that you're more the compartmentalized sort of person. On the other hand, if you're pretty much got the same attitude or the same mental states, no matter what you're doing, within reason, then you may be better off doing a more mindfulness vipassana kind of meditation. So I'm just going to move on to Libra Lamb's next question, which is kind of a political question. And it is as follows. Is voting for a lesser evil ignoble, considering how entrenched it is in the drama of competing evils? I've got Trump versus Biden on my mind and got riled up at the idea that Biden is weak and an ornamental object, and that Trump has pledged himself to Israel and disavowed January 6th. Well, it does make sense if you're voting. I've never heard of a purely good politician running for election. It is necessarily a matter of voting for the lesser evil. It's like Jesus Christ or Gautama Buddha, I mean, they're just not running for election. Even if they were alive today, they would refuse. So, yeah, I mean, you pretty much have to, if you're going to vote, you pretty much have to vote for the least bad person or the better person anyway. So, yeah, I mean, if you just, it's a matter of your own temperament again, you're like your own attitude. If you just can't stand voting for someone you consider to be not good enough, then you may just refuse to vote or just write in somebody. But between the two, I mean, I've got a pretty good idea who I would prefer. So I'm going to vote unless some act of God, so called, prevents me from doing it, or something. I should just move on to the next question here. This is from Pranav, and Pranav asks, in the past tense, how good were you at atanyu and kalanyu? And I'm pretty sure atanyu means knowledge of self or self-awareness, understanding yourself. Kalanyu, it means knowing the time. Kala means time. So knowing the time essentially means knowing the proper time. It's like knowing the correct timing for doing or saying certain things. So how good was I, presumably when I was a monk, at self-awareness and knowing the proper time for things? I assume that's what Pranav is asking. I'm not 100% sure that that's what he was asking, but that is how I interpret this. So self-awareness, I think I'm more self-aware than most people, using the term self figuratively, because ultimately in Orthodox Buddhism, like Theravada, there is no self. But figuratively, conventionally, you can say that, this person knows himself pretty well. This person is just clueless and just self-unaware. So, I mean, there were times, especially as a junior monk, that, I would just behave in just an outrageous, barbaric way in Burma. Yeah, I mean, I behaved in embarrassing ways sometimes when I was a monk in Burma. Just for example, just to give one example, I used to go for alms. I was a strict alms round goer. I would not accept food like offered to me in people's houses, offered to me inside the monastery. I'd take my bowl, go to the village, get my food, and come back. And there was part of my self-image as the young monk, just trying to be like the Buddhist Rambo, just trying to be very strict in doing this. And one time there was like this young couple. They were standing right at the monastery entrance. They wanted to offer food to the exotic foreign monk. And they're standing there. They obviously were standing there just for me. The other monks were coming in through a different entrance that day because they were going to a different village than I did. And they're standing there with like happy, excited smiles on their face. And I just walked past them and ignored them. And I could hear the woman gasp as I just sort of like snubbed them, And it's a lot of the time, like a junior monk, especially if he's very idealistic and trying to live up to these ideals, these standards that he's got set for himself, he can behave horribly. Like, for example, I heard this story. This one I didn't do, but there was a Western monk, a junior Western monk in Sri Lanka, who got invited to some kind of festival where the people were donating like a little bag of stuff to each monk. The monks were all standing there. They'd go down the line and offer the bag of things and offer the bag of things. And it's probably just standard stuff like soap and toothpaste, maybe a little hand towel or something. But the bag also contained like a bag of milk powder. And this young Western monk, he wasn't going to accept a bag of milk powder because that's food, and it was probably afternoon already. And so when they came to offer him the bag of stuff, he just slapped it through the air. He just slapped it out of the person's hands that was offering it to them. And he was considering himself to be very self-righteous while doing this. He considered himself to be completely justified. They were trying to offer a monk food in the afternoon. He wasn't going to have any of that. But, there were way better ways of going about it. He could ask them, could you just take the milk powder out before you offer it to me? Be very friendly, have metta in his heart, and it wouldn't have caused a scene like that. Or even better, he could have just determined that milk powder is not for me. I'll feed it to a dog or something. I'll give it away. I won't use it for food for myself, and therefore he could accept it without breaking a rule. But he didn't do that. So I guess Kalanyu, knowing the proper time for things, is, in a way, it's similar to Atanyu, or just self-awareness, because it's a matter of just being aware of what is appropriate, how not to misbehave, that kind of thing. So as I got older, I got better at it, although still there were times when I would behave in ways that were just incomprehensible to the Burmese mind. Like, Burmese people would come to visit me and I would just refuse to leave my cave. I would just refuse to meet with visitors. I wouldn't be yelling at them to go away or anything, but, I would just pretend like I wasn't there and essentially hide, pee into my own bath cup in order to avoid having to go outside and meet anybody. So, but then again, when it comes to self-knowledge, one tricky thing about self-knowledge is it's difficult for you to know what your own blind spots are because you don't see your own blind spots. It's like moha. You can be aware of your lobha and dosa. You can be aware of your attraction and aversion, but you can't be aware of your own delusion, at least not very well. Maybe in retrospect, you can think, wow, that was delusional when I did that. But almost by definition, you're not aware of your own delusion, because to the extent that you're aware of it, it's not delusion anymore. So it is possible that just about anybody can think that they understand themselves fairly well, when someone who knows them fairly well can look at them and just be painfully aware that this person is clueless with regard to X, Y, and Z. I hope that I am better at that sort of thing than I used to be. But it's hard to, you can't really quantify it. You can't give it a numerical value. With regard to Atanyo, I was like a 68. And Kalanyu, I scored like a 73. I don't know, you can't really say. So anyways, I'm just going to move on to Pranav's next question, which is another kind of political one. Can monks vote in elections? And yes, monks can vote in elections. There's no rule against it, because I don't think that there were elections in ancient India, in the Ganges Valley. Maybe there were elections in like the oligarchic republics. There were some oligarchic republics where the oligarchs at least would have some say, but that wouldn't include monks, because the monks would be out in the forest meditating at the roots of trees. But I do know that some monks are required to vote in elections, like Australian monks. At least when I was a monk, the Australian monks living in Burma, they were required by Australian law to vote. It's not like in America where you just don't vote. Every Australian citizen, at least at the time, I don't know if it's still that way now, is required by law to vote in elections. And so he would have to get an absentee ballot through the Australian embassy in Rangoon in order to vote in Australian elections, because if he didn't, he was breaking the law. So in a case like that, I guess monks pretty much have to vote in elections. As a monk, I only voted once. And I have to admit, I voted for Obama because he was running against Romney. And just out of curiosity, there was a presidential debate on YouTube when I was in America in 2011. And it was a debate between Obama and Romney. And it seemed pretty obvious to me that Obama was operating at a higher level of consciousness than Mitt Romney was. Mitt Romney just struck me as kind of like a shark with a plastic smile glued to its face. So pretty much in alarm, I voted against Mitt Romney rather than for Barack Obama. And I think that's the last time I voted Democrat, to tell you the truth, because things started getting really crazy after that. Like back around 2015, 16, It was like the craziness was really cranked up to about 11. And it's still there. It's still crazy. So I guess I answered that question. And so I'm just going to move on to Pranav's third question here. What do you think of monks using social media and modern technology? Would Buddha have allowed it? Well, it's hard to say what the Buddha would have allowed. It's like, would the Buddha have allowed something like that in ancient India? Or if the Buddha were alive today and living in the West or some such, would he allow it today? And I mean, some modern technology, Buddhism really is not anti technology, like with regard to medicine and so forth. That's modern technology also. I mean, it would be ridiculous if monks were forbidden to take state of the art malaria pills. You got some pale skinned, round eyed guy living in the tropics, and we've got almost no resistance to malaria. So I'd be dead several times over if I were not taking modern, technologically innovative malaria medication. The natives, like, the indigenous people of Burma who have ancestors have lived there for centuries, they've got this built in, they have evolved a certain resistance to malaria. But I had very little resistance. I gradually developed a little bit just from being exposed to it so much. But still, I would be dead several times over if it were not for that. Or even to get to Burma, I had to fly on an airplane. That's modern technology. So there's all kinds of modern technology that really are not an issue, that Buddhism really doesn't say anything against it. I mean, it does. I was told that when cars and trains and so forth first appeared in Burma, long ago during British colonial times, that there were very strict monks who would not ride in cars, because there is a rule that says a monk is not allowed to ride in a land vehicle unless it's a kind of rickshaw pulled by one man, that's like an ox cart. It's against the rules for a monk to ride in an ox cart unless he is sick. And I hurt my foot once and couldn't walk. I had to go travel 32 miles through the forest with this injured foot. So the villagers rented me an elephant to ride for the first 16 miles until we got to a road. And then I rode in an ox cart or a bullock cart for the next 16 miles. And I realized why it's against the rules for a monk who is not sick to ride in a bullock cart. And that is because these two bullocks, they receive like a 7-hour long beating. A bullock is not like a horse where, it just gets a good trot going and just keeps going. Bullocks, they start to slow down as soon as you stop hitting them. And so the guy's just hitting them the whole way. And I can understand how they'd make a rule against monks riding in bullock carts, like, for that reason. But then cars came along and there was no bullocks to get beaten from riding in cars. But the rule does say, like a land vehicle, unless it's pulled by one man. So a lot of strict monks would just walk everywhere. They refused to ride in a car or on a train or anything. You can ride in a boat because some places it's the only way to get across a river or something. But I'm just digressing all over the place, because the question here is, what do you think of monks using social media and modern technology? Well, the modern technology in general, I mean, you'd have to judge it by a case-by-case basis. But social media, yeah, I mean, you couldn't really have the Buddha making a rule against it in ancient India because there was no social media. People, as a general rule, were still illiterate in the Buddha's time. I mean, there was writing then, but it was only like certain classes of people that would take the trouble to learn writing. It was just like the educated classes would learn how to read and write, but it wasn't used for very much. Maybe like proclamations or just like record keeping for businesses and that kind of thing. But again, I'm digressing. So with regard to like Facebook or YouTube, I don't know what the Buddha would say. I mean, if he were alive today, would he want monks like surfing the web? I don't think he would. Maybe if a monk just strictly used it for Dhamma purposes, like promulgating Dhamma, then that might be acceptable. But a lot of monks are using it for things that are not very dharmic, like looking at porn. And certainly the Buddha would not promote that. That there would have to be rules against certain ways of using social media at the very least. It'd be against the rules to, look at porn on the internet, that kind of thing. So, what do I think of monks using social media? Yeah, it's really a dangerous thing, but it's also very valuable. Like the internet, it's like a new sense organ. I used to think about this a lot, where it's like the computer is like the sense organ, and using that sense organ, you have access to, practically infinite information. It's almost like having the divine eye, like being clairvoyant or something, where you want to learn about something, you just click on it. I'll come up with the Wikipedia article or the YouTube documentary or whatever, and you can learn about this. So in that sense, it's almost like a superpower. You can just communicate with people thousands of miles away. You can see things happening thousands of miles away. You can learn about things from some source of information thousands of miles away. It really is like a psychic power. But you have to have a certain amount of wisdom to use that psychic power responsibly. So I assume the Buddha would make rules, like with regard to, if he made any rules at all, that he would make rules about how to use it correctly instead of abusing it. And it's sort of like that in Vinaya. That's pretty much how Vinaya works. It's like they had knives in the Buddha's time. And so there's just rules about like what kind of knife a monk can use. It has to have like a short blade and so forth. So, yeah. In the Buddhist time, though, it was way stricter in the Buddhist time. They were very ascetic. They renounced the world in a radical manner. And so owning things like phones and computers and so forth, that would just be like scandalous for monks to do something like that in the Buddhist time. Of course, they didn't have phones or computers, but if the same standards applied to today, then almost all monks would be behaving in a very unacceptable manner, because there very few monks nowadays are like wandering forest dwelling renunciants. Most of them are living in fairly comfortable conditions and have access to a fairly good amount of wealth. I didn't own a computer until 2012. But you can get addicted to it. You just sit there and again, it's like a psychic power. You can just see all this stuff. Whatever you want to see, you can see it or hear it or whatever. So there would have to be some kind of rules regarding it, but I'm not sure if the Buddha would have allowed like monks using social media or monks using iPhones and computers, because ancient India is so different from today. The standards are so different. It's hard to say. If we had the same standards as ancient India, I don't think he would have allowed it. He wouldn't have allowed smoking tobacco either, pretty obviously. But today, if a Buddha arose today, if Maitreya Buddha arises in a technological civilization, what will he allow? What will he not allow? We're just going to have to wait until that happens, and then we'll find out. So after that long meandering semi-answer, I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Thur. I think that's how he pronounces his name, Thur. And he says, what are your thoughts on Ambedkar and Neo-Buddhism? And I got asked this a few Q&As ago, my opinion of Sri Ambedkar, Dr. Ambedkar. And he started a Buddhist movement in India. And I'm being asked, what is my opinion of this? Is it like a valid Buddhist system or what? And I really don't know that much about it. I do know that Dr. Ambedkar started converting like Dalits, I think they're called outcasts, untouchables, converting them to Buddhism as a way of escaping from this the oppression of the caste system in India. And it's my vague understanding. Like I say, I don't know much about him or much about this new Buddhist movement, but it does seem to have been largely politically and socially motivated more than spiritually motivated. That he was just trying to uplift the untouchables in India by converting them to Buddhism. And to this day, I have read that most of the Buddhists that follow this movement are of very low caste. It's not for everybody necessarily. I mean, theoretically, it could be, but it's mainly just a way of the untouchables in India of escaping to some degree from their position of being untouchables. All of a sudden, they're Buddhists, and so they don't have to worry about that shit anymore. So there is some debate. There has been some debate on my Discord channel, or my Discord server lately, about whether the Ambedkar Buddhist movement, or Neo-Buddhism, or Navayana, I think it's called, whether it's legit Buddhism or whether it's just a kind of social movement. And I really don't know that much about it. But I do get the impression that the purpose, I mean, it's like Dr. Ambedkar wanted to help the untouchables, and he came up with this idea, why don't they just all convert to Buddhism? And so he kind of went that way, and he may have been sincere in his Buddhism, but I do think that originally, at least, and one of the main purposes of it was just political and social more than spiritual. But that's just the impression I get based on just a very vague, hazy knowledge of the situation. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Personalization Primitive. And Personalization Primitive says, in Western occultism, it is often said that there are 4 virtues that underlie all spiritual attainments: to know, to dare, to will, to keep silence. How would a Buddhist relate to those qualities specifically in terms of spiritual development? Well, to know, the first of the 4, I mean, that's pretty much the goal in Buddhism. I mean, if you know reality, if you know like the 4 noble truths, just deep down, down to your center, then I mean that's it. You're there. You have attained it. In the like preliminary stages as a beginner, I mean, still to know would be like right view. Just having just to know how to practice, to know how to meditate, to know how to keep morality and so forth. Yeah, that would be important. I think most like Indo-European spiritual traditions do place a lot of emphasis on gnosis, or just knowledge, jhana. So yeah, that's in there. To dare, that's just essentially fearlessness. When you renounce the world and just wander around just a penniless, vagrant beggar, that takes a certain amount of courage if you're doing it for spiritual reasons. I mean, if you just run out of money, and you just kind of have to do it, you don't have any choice in the matter, that's different. But to voluntarily just renounce pretty much all of your social ties and just throw yourself on the mercy of the universe by becoming a wandering beggar, I mean, that takes courage. And to do that in the West takes possibly even more courage than it did in ancient India. So yeah, just general fearlessness would be the Buddhist approach of this, the virtue of to dare. You don't want to be too daring, though, I guess. I mean, you don't want to be a daredevil. So anyways, the third one is to will. And I mean, will is what you're gradually trying to get away from, although like determination is one of the 10 paramis, adhitthana, or like vigor, ardent practice. I mean, that's got some will involved. And that's one of the 5 faculties is virya, or just like manly effort. Also, proper effort, right effort, is part of the Eightfold Path. That would presumably involve some will. So I mean, the will would be guiding your practice. And then eventually, when you get there, when you become fully enlightened, you stop having will, essentially. I mean, to the outward observers, you would still seem to have will, but it's like neutralized. So let's see here. And to keep silence, well, silence is important too. I mean, a monk is forbidden to take a vow of silence, like a Carthusian monk in Roman Catholicism. But some monks are whizzy bait in Burma. In fact, my own teacher, sometimes he just walk around with his mouth full of water. You know, he just walk around with his mouth full of water, which helped him to not talk, I guess, and might also be a little kind of an indication to people that he wasn't going to talk because look at his mouth's full of water or something. But yeah, keeping silence, there's a right place and time for that. It might be most places and most times, but still there are times when it's proper to speak also. So with regard to spiritual development, I mean, to know in a conventional sense just helps you to know how to practice, how to approach the goal. And then when you reach the goal, then you really know. That's ultimate knowledge. That's, ultimate truth. To dare, that's, I would just say, fearlessness and just the willingness to radically renounce. That involves some daring. To will is, determination and just vigor, ardent practice. That would be will, I suppose, in a Buddhist context. And to keep silence is mainly just to be quiet most of the time. So I guess I answered that question. I hope I answered that question because I'm moving on to the next one. And this is from Rourke. And Rourke says, I'm gonna look and make sure that we are recording. Yep, we're recording. That's good. Rourke says, I'm not sure whether to believe in anything paranormal. Everyone seems to have a ghost story, and I'm aware of the near-death experience and reincarnation research, but you would think there would be a picture or a video or something which would satisfy me more than mere testimony. Do you know of anything like that? What's your best evidence of the paranormal? So that's actually two questions. I better separate these. 2 question marks, 2 questions. Okay. So with regard to some kind of proof of the paranormal or just damned convincing persuasive evidence of the paranormal, I did read a book called The Trickster and the Paranormal by George P. Hansen, and he explains why there's never going to be proof of the paranormal because the paranormal is like a fringe phenomenon that we have to have a certain structure and just like reliability to our world. And that the paranormal is what kind of bleeds through the cracks between the rules that keep our world structured and more or less predictable. And so it's always going to like avoid rules and avoid any kind of objective proof. That's where the trickster element comes in. And yeah, I can appreciate that. But so I don't think that there's ever going to be proof. I mean, to some degree, there is proof. Like the experiments of Helmut Schmidt, not the German politician, but the German engineer at Boeing who started experimenting when things were slow. The lab was just kind of idle. He asked permission from upper management if it was okay for him to do research on the influence of mentality on physical systems. And he came up with some really elegant experiments for like demonstrating that the mind does have an influence on physical systems, or what are considered to be physical systems by Western materialists. And so he came up with a random number generator. And usually his random number generator either generated just between 1, 2, 3, 4, or just between 1 and 2. It'd just be a random assemblages of 1s and 2s. That it was genuinely random. It wasn't based on like numerals on like from an irrational number or something. That's like a fake random number generator. But it was based on a Geiger counter and a radioactive isotope And if the Geiger counter clicked, at one of two times it would be counted as a one, and it counted one of the other of two times it would be counted as a two. I don't know how well I'm explaining this, but it would just be a random assemblage of, like in headphones, it'd just be a random assemblage of clicks in the left or the right ear. It would be like based on quantum randomness, that there'd either be clicks in the right or left ear. And then you would have experimental subjects put on the headphones, and he would say, try to make more clicks happen in your left ear, or try to make more clicks on the right side. And you could do these experiments very quickly. It wouldn't take more than several seconds to do one of these runs. And so he found out that especially certain people, they might be like 3% above random, which you run so many tests statistically that is solid evidence that the mind is influencing what is generally considered to be a physical system. And the really amazing thing to me was that he could record the random clicks onto a cassette tape, and still, if no one had listened to that cassette tape yet, people could still influence whether there's going to be more clicks on the left side or on the right side of this stereo tape, because it was like the cassette tape, the recorded aspect of the cassette tape was still in a state of quantum randomness, that nobody had perceived it and collapsed the state vector yet. And then he was even like, there are certain people who just vehemently deny anything that was paranormal. There's this group called Psycop, and one of their more well-known members is this, I can't remember what his real, James Randi or something like that. He used to be a magician called the Amazing Randi, and they just try to debunk any claims of any kind of paranormal activities. They try to debunk any kind of parapsychology experiments or anything like that. And so this Helmut Schmidt, he could send the cassette tape to one of his critics and say, just put this in your vault. Put it, he'd have a duplicate of it. And he'd just say, take this copy, put it in your safe. And then he'd have somebody, and then you get to pick whether there's going to be more on the left side or the right side. And then he'll have one of his more talented students listen to it, trying to make more clicks on whichever side that the skeptic insisted upon, and then it would still work. And I don't think I explained that very well. But a lot of these skeptics, or the critics, I mean, they're not skeptics at all, because they firmly disbelieve something, and that's not skepticism. Skepticism is suspending judgment. But, I mean, sometimes it gets to the point where they'll just say, well, they have to be cheating. They can't find out any way of really debunking it other than saying it's impossible, so they have to be cheating. Anyways, I mean, if you read a parapsychology book, then you may come across information in that book that may be more persuasive than me rambling about Helmut Schmidt. Although if it's a good parapsychology book, hopefully it will have a section on Helmut Schmidt and his experiments with people influencing clicks in a Geiger counter, for example. But gosh, I mean, with proof, I think I am going with George P. Hansen and The Trickster and the Paranormal, and there's just never going to be proof other than indirect, subtle proofs that don't really get into the mainstream, because that will destabilize the world we live in or something. So anyways, Rourke's second question is, what's your best evidence of the paranormal? And I think I've got two fairly good bits of evidence on the paranormal. I mean, other than just stuff that I've read, like you read about Neem Karoli Baba and just miracles just flowed from the man. But just setting aside people like Neem Karoli Baba, just based on my own experience. One was when I was like 13 years old. I've told this story several times by now, where we had a poltergeist in our house. My father was a weird occultist, hypnotist. He was a liminal person. Weird stuff happened around him. And we had a poltergeist in our house. It's like you'd open the drawer to the silverware drawer, and there'd be like forks and spoons all bent in weird shapes, or just like, especially the handles would just pop off of coffee cups in the cupboards. Just weird stuff would appear in the house, that kind of thing. And so one summer, my father was hiring a new housekeeper to, keep the house, because that's what housekeepers do. And he was explaining to her that there was a poltergeist in the house. So if she found any broken dishes, for example, she shouldn't immediately blame us kids because there was this poltergeist in the house. And while he was telling her that, I was sitting at the table with them. And I could see that she's slowly getting a grin on her face, and one eyebrow is kind of going up. Like, she can't decide whether he's joking or crazy. And then literally within just a few seconds of him reaching the end of his description of how things spontaneously self-destruct because of this poltergeist, an ashtray that was right on the table, right in between them, on the corner of the table. My father was sitting at one end of the table. She was sitting at one side. That corner right in between them had this ashtray. And the ashtray made this sound like zink, and just split into two halves that slid about an inch and a half away from each other. And I mean, it was just in plain sight of everybody. And so immediately, of course, the grin went away, and both of her eyebrows attained the same level, which was pretty high up on her forehead, I suppose. And she started taking him seriously. And at the very least, you'd have to admit it's one hell of a case of synchronicity that, for whatever reasons, a glass ashtray just split in half. I mean, there was a lit cigarette butt in the ashtray, but there had been hundreds or thousands of lit cigarette butts in that ashtray previously, and it didn't self-destruct. So that would be one case that I would consider pretty good evidence of something paranormal. At the very least, it's one hell of a case of synchronicity. But another case would be there's like a group mind that happens with me and other people, and it's relatively strong with my sweetheart, the woman I love. We have sort of this group mind going where just repeatedly, and especially at certain times, it kind of goes through waves. I'll just say something, and she was right at the verge of opening her mouth to say the same thing, and then she's like amazed by that. Or one of my favorite examples was I was at work one day, and I just texted her, just casually. I just texted to her, I huff your cleavage, something like that. And then I get this text back from her saying, okay, psychic boy, because it turned out that right when I was texting about huffing her cleavage, she was testing to see if her deodorant still worked by pulling out her shirt and like sniffing her own, like the space down, like between her shirt and her bosom. And it was right then that I sent the thing. And you can call it just random chance, but there's a hell of a lot of it that happens between us that it's at the very least, it's just more synchronicity. So those are my best personal evidences of the paranormal. I mean, I have seen apparitions and so forth, but with an apparition, you can't really be sure that it's something out there and not like hallucination or something. So I guess I better just move on to the next question here. This is from Scaladin. And Scaladin says, between Peter Gibbons from The Office and Neo from The Matrix, who seems wiser? Well, I have to admit, I've never seen The Office. I've never seen a single episode of it. I can't remember seeing a clip from The Office. So I don't know who Peter Gibbons is. But if we just completely dismiss the sequels to The Matrix, which kind of went off in their own direction, the first Matrix movie was a profound philosophical movie. And then after that, they just kind of ignored most of the philosophy and just made like special effects action movies. But if you just go with the original Matrix movie, then Neo, by the end of the movie, he is symbolically fully enlightened. It's like when he dies and is reborn, and he stops the bullets with his mind, The agents are shooting at him, and then he dives into Agent Smith, right into his chest, and causes Agent Smith to explode. I mean, Agent Smith is symbolically like Mara or the devil. And so at the moment of enlightenment, or shortly after the moment of enlightenment, Neo actually merges with the devil and kind of vaporizes the devil, even though he comes back in the sequels. How you doing? My dog is paying attention to me. So yeah, I mean, Neo seems pretty wise by the end of the movie. I mean, he's doubting Thomas towards the beginning. Like, symbolically, the beginning of the movie, towards the beginning, it shows Neo asleep at his computer. And the computer screen says searching, ... And that is, like, symbolically the state he is in at the beginning of the movie. He's not awake yet. He's not awakened, but he is searching. And then by the end of the movie, he's the one. He's the fully enlightened Messiah. So I don't know how you could get much wiser than fully enlightened. So even though I have no idea who Peter Gibbons is, I would say that Neo from the Matrix, the first Matrix movie, not the sequels, eventually became fully enlightened. So if Peter Gibbons was fully enlightened, at least they'd be like tied for first place or something. So I'll just move on to Skeladden's next question, which is, could you give some examples of films that try to represent symbolic wisdom, but due to intellectual insufficiency, it becomes superstition? And I'm not sure of any movie that tries to represent symbolic wisdom, but just becomes superstition. I mean, there's a lot of like really profound movies that try to like purvey a wise philosophical message that are just completely misunderstood. For example, The Matrix that I just mentioned, the first Matrix movie, forget the sequels. Most people see that. They don't see it as a profound philosophical movie. They just see a special effects science fiction action movie. It just doesn't sink in. Like the book Lord of the Flies. I mean, that is a profound philosophical and religious book. And I knew people with university educations, intelligent people who would read the book, forget the movies. They would read that book and be completely oblivious that the entire thing is an allegory. It's a kind of parable. Everything in that book is symbolic of something else. I mean, any of the movies that are like some of these science fiction movies about like people living in a fake reality, like The 13th Floor would be another example, or Dark City would be another example. There's a lot of examples of it that, there's like the standard philosophical message of the movie that people just don't get it. They just go into vegetative mode when they watch a movie, and they're just watching it for the explosions and the special effects, and they don't realize that they've been exposed to a profound philosophical movie. Apocalypse Now is another one. I mean, Apocalypse Now is, it's a profound movie based on Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad that wasn't about the Vietnam War at all. It's really not about the Vietnam War. It's about what happens to a sensitive, intelligent man of some depth and character when he tries to ignore the distinctions between good and evil. And that's Colonel Kurtz in the movie. And he goes insane. I mean, you can't do it. It's sort of like Raskolnikov in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. He tries to do the same thing. He tries to just rise above the distinction between good and evil. He tries to become like a Nietzschean Superman, and it pretty much just destroys his mind. It just messes him up because you can't get away from that. And there is somebody somebody a little farther down on the list of questions here that asks a question kind of about that. So, yeah, there are a lot of films that try to represent symbolic wisdom, and people just don't get it. Like The Seventh Seal, Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal is a profound philosophical movie. And most people just remember, the knight playing chess with death on the beach. And, I mean, they don't really understand what it's about. So there are a lot of movies like that. So let's see. And then there's some movies that are so profound that I don't fully understand it either. Like Pi, the movie Pi. I'm still haven't made up my mind on that one. Groundhog Day, I'm not sure if Groundhog Day really is like a parable for reincarnation where you just have to keep doing it over and over again until you get it perfect, or whether it was just, maybe it may be that the people who wrote the screenplay did not have a clue with regard to the Buddhist or Hindu concept of reincarnation. It just made a good movie. So, but there are lots and lots of movies. I think most people who watch most symbolic, profound movies, I mean, it doesn't turn into superstition. It's just like whoosh, right over their head. They don't get it. But they enjoy the movie anyway, like The Matrix. I mean, it's a good movie. Even if you don't understand the symbolism of it, of which there is lots. Still, I mean, it's still a good movie and people like the movie. Good explosions and fights and stuff in it. So anyways, I might as well just move on to Scaladin's third question here, which is, are there any science fiction writers that you feel were spiritually insightful? I haven't read any of Philip K. Dick's work before, but I stumbled across a talk he gave on The Matrix in '77. It looks like they lifted quite a bit of material from this talk for the first Matrix movie. Yeah, a lot of science fiction writers, I mean, they're liminal people. They're not normies necessarily. So they will have some deep philosophical insights. One of my favorite science fiction authors was Brian Aldiss. And I don't think he was particularly spiritual, but he did write stories that had some profundity to them, including one of his favorite themes was, in the future, you have AI, computers that become effectively omniscient. And then there's like a religion based on omniscient computers where people will go to the omniscient computer to ask it questions and so forth. Everybody has like this altar with this omniscient computer on it. And they go there to discuss their problems and so forth. And of course, the omniscient computer gives them wise advice because it is omniscient. Anyone who has the opportunity to read a short story by Brian Aldiss called Indifference, I mean, that is really a beautiful story. I really like that story. But let's see, like Gene Wolfe, his Book of the New Sun. I mean, it's profound. That is a profound book. I mean, that could be scripture. I mean, the Book of the New Sun has got more wisdom in it than a lot of actual scriptures do. But that was like his magnum opus, I think. I don't think all of Gene Wolfe's writings are that profound. So, any other science fiction writers? When I was in high school, my favorite science fiction writer was Larry Niven, but he mainly just had really good aliens. And it was very like hard science fiction. He tried to make everything scientifically plausible. But he was a good storyteller, but not much philosophy to it. So, yeah, I guess my best example of a spiritually insightful science fiction work, which would have to be written by someone who had some spiritual insight, would be Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun. And it's, I would consider it to be at least as deep as the book Moby Dick. It really is profound. So I'm just going to move on to the next question from Indian Guy, who also goes by the alias of Trevor. And Indian Guy says, what's your favorite story of the Buddha? And even when I was like boating on the lake the other day, celebrating the love for my woman and everything, I was still thinking about what is my favorite story of the Buddha? Because I had read this question. It was asked a few days ago. And it's difficult to come up with a favorite story of the Buddha. In fact, the best I could come up with would be stories that had the Buddha in them, but he wasn't even really the main protagonist. Like the story of the Buddha in the Gautika Sutta, where Gautika is this monk who gets jhana and loses it and gets it and loses it and gets it and loses it. So finally he's in a state of desperation and he decides he's going to kill himself before he loses it. After he gets it the next time, he's just going to cut his own throat before he loses it again, because if you die with jhana, you're pretty much guaranteed of a very high heaven realm, a Brahma realm. Whereas if you die without jhana, there's no guarantees. And then he winds up becoming fully enlightened as he's bleeding out. And then the Buddha, with his clairvoyance, he sees that Gautama has killed himself. The Buddha is living at Vulture Peak, which isn't too far away from the Black Rock at Isigiri Cave. So he tells the Sangha, well, the monk Gautama has died. We need to go and cremate the body. And so they go and they're getting everything together, and they find Gautama, who's lying twisted to one side on his bed. And my explanation for why he was twisted to one side, it doesn't really say why he was twisted to one side, but I'm just guessing that he was very conscientiously leaning over the side of the bed so he wouldn't get blood and gore all over the bed that was owned by the Sangha. And then they find the Buddha sees this mist that's moving in all directions, to the north, to the south, to the east, to the west. It's just moving around and around. And the Buddha points this mist out to the monks and says, you see that mist that's moving in all directions? That's Mara, the evil one, who's looking for the consciousness of Gautama. But Mara doesn't realize that the consciousness of Gautama has become unestablished, which means that Gautama is enlightened in his mind. His consciousness is no longer an aspect of samsara, and so Mara is never going to find it. So stories like that that demonstrate the Buddha's wisdom and mastery and so forth, I like stories like that. And there may be some actual truth to that story. And stories that may sound like uplifting or entertaining stories that just kind of smack of like mythology. I still have a certain amount of skepticism with regard to a lot of that sort of thing that you find in the text. But another one would be like in the Bahia Sutta, Udana 110, which is kind of similar, where you have this non-Buddhist philosopher named Bahia. Literally, it means outsider, who's living way over on the west coast of India. And he starts to think that he's fully enlightened because he's getting so much respect from people and so forth. And he has attained something in his meditation. And so he's starting to think to himself, maybe he really is fully enlightened. But then a deva, a small g god, who had formerly been like a relation to Gautama as a human, comes to him and out of compassion tells him, sorry, Gautama, but you're not fully enlightened. But there is an enlightened being called the Buddha, who lives, in the Ganges Valley. And so Bahia just immediately, he's so inspired by this. He just immediately packs up his shit and just takes off walking and just keeps going until he finds the monastery where the Buddha was staying. And he asks, where's the Buddha? And they say, the Buddha is walking for alms in the village right now, but if you wait, he'll be back soon. And he just can't wait. He goes out and finds the Buddha, who's just walking for alms with his bowl, collecting his daily meal. And he says, please teach me. And then the Buddha says, I'm walking for alms. This isn't a convenient time. Can you meet me back at the monastery or something? And Bahia is saying, I don't know when I'm going to die. I need to know now. And so finally, the third time, the Buddha relents and gives him this very Zen-like kind of speech where he's saying, all right, Gautama, thus should you train yourself. In the seen, there will be only the seen. In the heard, there will be only the heard. In the felt, there will be only the felt. In the mentally sensed, there will be only the mentally sensed. When in the seen, there is only the seen. In the heard, there is only the heard. In the felt, there is only the felt. And in the mentally sensed, there is only the mentally sensed. Then, Bahia, there is no thereby. And when Bahia, there is no thereby, there is no therein. And when there is no therein, there is no here, no hereafter, no between the two. This is the very end of unease. And upon hearing that, which was just what he was right before, he immediately becomes enlightened. He's not even a Buddhist monk at the time. He's not a Buddhist really, but he becomes enlightened. And then just minutes later, just very shortly afterward, he gets trampled or gored by a young cow. And then the Buddha, when he goes back to the monastery, he says, he sends some monks to go and pick up the body of Bahya, who's lying dead in the street. And they take him, and the Buddha has him cremated as though he were a Buddhist monk, because he became a member of the Arya Sangha by becoming enlightened. So he was sort of an honorary member of the Sangha, and so the Buddha had him cremated as though he were a real monk. So stories like that I like, that have like some semblance of historicity to it, that it may show some real insight into who the Buddha was, like personality wise, and what he was like, that kind of thing. So anyways, this is turning into a longer Q&A than I was planning. We're already above 2 hours. I think we only had like 33 questions. So I'm just going to move on to Indian guy's next question here, which is as follows. A Pali translator who talks a lot about archaic Buddhism on YouTube said that in one of the Nikayas that Gautama wanted to call his teaching Brahmayana. Have you seen this in the Nikayas? I don't remember what sutta it is, but I have read where the Buddha was teaching, I think it was a Brahmin. And it's a sutta where the Buddha is teaching the 4 Brahma Viharas, or the 4 divine abidings, the 4 divine abodes, which is metta, karuna, mudita, and upekkha. If you don't know what that means, that's fine. And then he was saying that is like the way to going to Brahma. Like the Brahmins had their own ideas. Like the Brahmacharya is like the celibate student stage of the life of a Brahmin. And the Buddha would just kind of twist that a little bit and make it more Buddhist. And he'd say, if you really want to go to Brahma, then you practice these 4 Brahma Viharas. And I think it was Richard Gombrich, who was the president of the Polytech Society at one point, teacher of Sanskrit at Oxford, I think, that was actually using that as a way of saying that you can become enlightened through practicing metta, that the Buddha taught metta as a path to enlightenment, which is kind of pushing it a little bit. That wouldn't be a strictly orthodox interpretation. But I do think that might be what this Pali translator was referring to, is a sutta where the Buddha is teaching the 4 Brahma Viharas to a Brahmin and saying that, that is the real Brahmayana. But to say that the Buddha wanted to call Buddhism Brahmayana, that's kind of silly, because he could call it whatever he wanted to. If he wanted to call it Brahmayana, then he'd call it Brahmayana. He wouldn't just be calling it Dhamma or something. What are you doing? Now I got another dog paying attention to me. Yeah. So, I guess I assume that is what he is referring to. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Extremely Rare Bird. An extremely rare bird says, I have been wondering about something that I feel lie at the heart. Oh, okay. I've been wondering about something that I feel lies at the heart of some of Dostoevsky's books. The fact that we have a conscience, whether we like it or not. One that seems to live a life of its own. Something which seems to know and hint about that which we are not and push us towards that direction. I think discovering this aspect of mind is what makes a lot of people convert to monotheistic religion, when they suddenly find inside themselves an autonomous force that is striving towards the good. For Buddhists, this conscience can be seen in the larger context of the Four Noble Truths, rather than a force of a God that we must pay heed to, so it's downplayed like a lot of mental processes are. But still, I think it's mind-blowing that there is such a dynamic within us. I keep asking myself, how is this possible? I want to ask, have you given any thought to this? And if so, how is this conscience related to Buddhism? Well, there is a kind of conscience in Buddhism. In fact, there's more than one kind of conscience in Buddhist philosophy. Like Hiri and Ottappa, which may at one point have been a kind of like synonyms. But Hiri it mainly means like conscientiousness, like not wanting to do anything bad. Otapa is more like fear of evil consequences of your actions. So it's sort of like you don't want, the first hiri is sort of like not wanting to do anything bad, and otapa is like not wanting to have to deal with the consequences of having done something bad. And then there's other kinds of conscience that are unskillful, like a guilty conscience, regret, remorse. That's um, kukucha, which is always bad karma. Because if you're going to feel like pangs of conscience, you should feel it before you do the deed and not after you do the deed. So that's the difference between wholesome conscience and unwholesome conscience. Is the wholesome conscience is preventing you from doing what you're like inclined to do, whereas the unwholesome conscience is just beating you up afterwards, after you've already done what you shouldn't have done. So anyways, there is that. And I should point out that Buddhist ethics are not based on some sort of heavenly decree. There is no capital G God like declaring what is moral and immoral. That in Buddhism, what is moral and immoral are based on human psychology. So if you tell a lie, it's going to make you feel at least a little bit icky. And that's what lie detector tests do. It's like, you start to sweat a little more. The electrical conductivity of your skin increases because you're exuding sweat. So it's like, if you're mindful enough, if you're self-aware enough, then you can just tell if you do something that is unethical, like stealing or lying or killing, you can feel it in yourself that you're harming yourself to some degree. That a certain amount of sensitivity and like wisdom is enough that you can actually feel that in yourself. But also, beyond that level is just the way karma works. And karma is sort of based on the same principle of you do a certain act, it's going to have a certain effect on your mind. And if you do a good act, it's going to have a positive effect on your mind. If you do a bad act, in the long run at least, it's going to have a bad effect on your mind. You might not be fully aware of that bad effect. I mean, it's sort of like the droogs in A Clockwork Orange, they're just laughing uproariously while they're beating people to death and raping women and so forth. But it's like the hooting, this uproarious laughter is just a way of kind of drowning out their own conscience. So I consider that to be kind of a profound aspect of the movie A Clockwork Orange. When they're laughing in this uproarious manner, they're sort of hooting like apes while they're just perpetrating all these atrocities. That in a way they're just kind of drowning out their own conscience while they're doing it, just assuming that they have a conscience. But yeah, conscience has different levels. It's like Freud talks about the superego, which is largely just a cultural I want to say cultural construct, but it's sort of an accumulation of these cultural ideas about what you should and shouldn't do. Maybe some of it's just based on your own personal experience, but that's sort of like at the level of, it wouldn't be at the level of ego because it's superego, but still it's at the level of like conscious thinking, conscious thought processes. And that's not a very good kind of conscience because, you can just have like really screwed up ideas about morality and they'll just kind of take over your conscience in that respect. Some Jewish people might just be beating themselves up with remorse because they happened to eat some apple pie that had lard in the pie crust. And then they didn't do it on purpose, but still, they just destroyed themselves. Or then you got like Islamic terrorists who think they're going to go to heaven for blowing up innocent people. So that kind of conscience is not very reliable, but the deeper kind where you're actually experiencing like the karmic results of your actions just immediately. Like if you're telling a lie, you just feel that it's not quite right because it's having this adverse effect on your own personality. That isn't necessarily all culturally constructed. It's a sort of a universal human psychology that doing certain acts are going to have certain adverse effects on you just due to just the makeup of the human mind. Deviating from truth or deviating from fairness, deviating from just live and let live. If you're like killing for fun, then it's going to have a certain effect on your mind, even though you may have such a crude mind that you're unaware of the deeper effect that it's having on you, that you just cannot see that you're really harming yourself by doing it, but deep down you know. And a capital G God really isn't necessary for that. So, let's see, what is the question? Okay, have you given any thought to this? And I'd say, yeah, that's the answer to the question is yes. Oh, wait, and if so, how is this conscience related to in Buddhism? Well, I already pretty much described conscience in 10,000 words or less. So I think I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Nicola. And Nicola says, I have a feeling that you figured, consciously or subconsciously, something is wrong with Buddhism. I think all philosophies fail to explain life existence. According to my own theory, life existence is pure free will. There is self, and that easily explains determinism or no self. I am determined to prove that this theory can explain all reality. I think it can be useful for scientific life discoveries. This theory actually ceases to be a theory anymore once you realize it's the only possible reality. And figuring out or experiencing or just living our will, which is determined, is what makes life interesting. Dual pleasure and suffering. I would like to hear your opinion. Well, he starts off saying that he has a feeling that I figured consciously or subconsciously something is wrong with Buddhism. Well, the only thing that I figured that is wrong with Buddhism is that it has become corrupted over time. But I have no problem at all with like no self, for example. So all philosophies fail to explain life existence, or he's got life / existence. And then according to his own theory, life or existence is pure free will. So there is a self. And so, I mean, it seems like the onus would be on, let's see, what's his name? Nicola, that to prove that free will is even possible. Because, I mean, logically, free will is not even possible, not even in theory. Like Albert Einstein, who was no idiot, by the way. I mean, you can say that he stole some of his ideas from other mathematicians or whatever, but he was no dummy. And he used to say that he had no idea what people were talking about when they would mention free will, because it's almost like a contradiction in terms. I mean, going with logic, something has to have a cause or it doesn't have a cause. If it has a cause, then it is deterministic and not free. But if it does not have a cause, I mean, it's random. If something happens without a cause, anything can happen at any time because there's no cause. And so, I mean, neither one of those is free will. I mean, determinism isn't free will. So your actions, your decisions having a cause, I mean, if your decisions have a cause, then that's not free will, because it's the cause that is determining your decision. And if you choose between one cause determining one decision and another cause determining another decision, then that choice also has a cause further back. And you can't have an infinite regress. So either your decisions, your actions have a cause or they don't. And if they don't have a cause, again, you're left with random chance, which would be more like an epileptic seizure than what anyone considers to be free will. So I think that would be the first task of anyone insisting on free will as like the only explanation of life or existence, is how is it even possible? Strangely, the Buddha rejects both determinism and free will. He rejects determinism mainly because he rejected in the suttas the philosophy of the Ajivakas, which was purely deterministic. But also, as I've already mentioned, in the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta, his second formal discourse after his enlightenment, according to tradition, he was saying that even with regard to will or Jhana, we cannot say, let it be this way, let it not be that way, and have it reliably happen. We do not have complete control even over our own volitions. And partly, I would say, is if you're unenlightened, then, I mean, you're behaving out of knee-jerk reflex and like instinct. And so you're not fully awake. You're not fully aware of what's causing your decision making. And so a kind of automatic pilot, also known as karma, just sort of takes over and makes your decisions for you. But I really do not see most people as exercising free will in any obvious way. Because if you make a decision, there is a reason for that decision. And the reason is determining that decision. So let's see here. Yeah, I don't think it's the only possible reality. I mean, the existence of a self, I mean, that is, it's even more problematic for me than the existence of free will. Although free will would require an individual self, not a universal self like Brahman to the Hindus, but or like in the Upanishads, but it would be like an individual self. And anything that's dividing the universe up into separate parts, I mean, I do not consider that to be ultimate reality. That dividing the world up into, or dividing the cosmos up into individual parts, that is a psychological act of perception. That you have to use relations in order to separate this from that. You know, there has to be a like different from, separating this from that. Otherwise, they just merge into the same thing. You have to perceive a difference between two things. And that perception of a difference is just a mental state. It's not existing out there somewhere. Like, as I've said before, a chemist, if he's analyzing a sample of matter into its component elements, he's not going to be able to isolate pure same as or pure different from. That is just a relation that exists in your mind. And without those relations, the world of multiplicity disappears. So, I guess that's my opinion. And this is turning into a kind of a long one. So I better just move on to the next question. And this is from the proto-pseudo-monk. And the proto-pseudo-monk says, "You have said that when you were a monk, you would follow the Vinaya as strictly as possible, and monks must follow many rules. I don't quite fully understand the purposes or the purpose of these rules." My rationale was, these rules tried to emulate the behavior of an enlightened being, sort of fake it till you make it. For example, an enlightened being would naturally never lie and would never intentionally drink alcohol, but other rules the logic doesn't follow. They seem conditionally cultured. What I don't fully understand is how arbitrary conventional rules can affect your karma. It's as if the rules are karmically superior than your intention. In sum, why must monks keep Vinaya? Moreover, why did you follow the rules so strictly, despite believing that Theravada Buddhism, bhikkhus and arahants, didn't have a monopoly on enlightenment? What's your motivation reasoning? So that's two different questions. We got to separate these. All right. So the first question is, in sum, why must monks keep Vinaya? Well, there is a kind of, I think it's in the Vinaya itself, in the books of Vinaya, where monks are asking the Buddha, why is it that the Buddhism founded by previous Buddhas didn't last very long? And the Buddha said it's because previous Buddhas didn't have a Vinaya. They didn't have monastic rules, so that everything just kind of fell apart shortly after the charismatic, enlightened founder of the system died. So that's kind of borne out by, in the Vinaya Chulalaga, it's got the history, the official history of the first great council after the Buddha died. And I mentioned this just recently on a Q&A, where there was, after the Buddha, when he attained parinibbana, he died. He left his body, as they say in India, um, a lot of the monks were despondent. The enlightened monks were serene as usual, but some of the unenlightened, like the junior monks and the monks that really had a lot of defilements that they couldn't really uh, deal with fully in this life, they were despondent. They were grieving because their teacher had died. And then this one monk, who was an old monk who was ordained when he was old and therefore, set in his ways and hard to teach and all that, he's like saying, what's the problem? Now the Venerable Gautama isn't here telling us do this, don't do that all the time. We can do whatever we please. And Mahakassapa, the senior monk in the Sangha at that time, heard that and was alarmed. And so that was his reason for setting up the first council in which they would agree upon a monastic code for monks to follow. And some of the monastic code is not really ethical in nature. I mean, it's not unethical for you to grow long hair. It's not unethical for you to wear a robe that isn't cut and sewn and dyed in certain ways. It's not unethical to eat food after midday. There's all these things that you follow, but it's sort of, I had an old Burmese monk tell me that the main purpose of Vinaya is to be, to live a life that is simple and harmless. And to some degree, some of the rules are just there so that the Sangha won't get a bad reputation. If you've got monks with bad manners and so forth, then it's going to reflect badly on Buddhism in general. And so there are rules of etiquette and just proper conduct that aren't necessarily ethical, but they are social in nature, just so the monks won't be behaving like jerks and offending people and so forth. But also, there's so many rules that to some degree, Vinaya just kind of makes your decisions for you. Like there's just a way of cleaning your room. There's a way of going to the bathroom. There's a way of bathing. There's all these rules with regard to all this stuff. And if you follow all the rules strictly, it's just sort of like, in a way, it's helping you to overcome your own personal preferences for one thing. And also it's just giving you like this blameless, simple way of living, and it's just sort of making your decisions for you. So there's that also. It's not all just imitating the behavior of an enlightened being. Although an enlightened being would, the Buddha himself would probably follow his own rules. But as I implied earlier, it may be that the Buddha really didn't set up all these rules, that it was at the first council after the Buddha died that they decided they better set up some rules just to establish some structure and some consistency and some stability to the system. Because with no rules, then everyone does whatever they feel like, and you wind up with Tantra Jhana and all this kind of stuff. Although even the Tantra Jhanists, I assume, have rules. So it adds structure to the system, is one of the main reasons for it. So let's see here. I think I answered the first part of this question. And also, like I mentioned in a previous Q&A, that nobody is forcing a monk to be ordained, except in rare cases when some kid is sent to the monastery by his parents and they just want a monk in the family, and that's just the way it is. Asian families can be this way. You're going to be a monk whether you want to be or not, or you're going to be a doctor or an engineer whether you want to be or not, because if you don't, you disgrace our family, that kind of thing. So, but for the most part, especially in the Buddhist time and in the modern West, nobody's forcing you to be a monk. And so nobody is forcing you to take upon yourself all these rules. But if you are taking upon yourself all these rules by becoming a monk, it's your duty to follow the rules. If you don't follow the rules, that's cheating. So there's different ways of looking at why monks would follow Vinaya rules. Eventually it got to the point that some of the rules were just so counterproductive. Or just, like the classic example was there is a rule saying that you're not allowed to open a door with your bowl in your hand. You have to set the bowl down. You can't just set it on the floor either, because there's a different rule against that, because you might scuff off the black coating on the bowl. You have to set it down on a stand or on a piece of cloth or something. Then you open the door, then you pick your bowl up, you walk through the door, then you have to set it down again, and then you close the door, then you pick the bowl back up and continue on your way. And meanwhile, 4 or 5 Anopheles mosquitoes have just flown into your cabin while you've got the door open going through this ritual. And the whole purpose for that was to prevent monks from breaking their clay bowl against an opening door, when nowadays almost no monks at all still use clay bowls. In Burma, or like in Thailand, they're almost all stainless steel. You're not gonna break your bowl hitting it against the door. In fact, you're not even gonna scrape off some of the black coating, because I think a lot of Thai monks don't even bother to coat or to like bake their bowls until it's black. It's just like stainless steel color. So, I mean, eventually that was the sort of thing that got me to start breaking certain rules, because it just seemed ridiculous. So, I think I answered that question in various ways, various rambling, random ways. And so, here's the part. See, moreover, why did you follow the rules so strictly despite believing that Theravada Buddhism didn't have a monopoly on enlightenment? What was your motivation and reasoning? Well, I mean, even though Theravada Buddhism doesn't have a monopoly on enlightenment, in my opinion, still, they've got their system. I chose to follow that system. I considered Theravada Buddhism to be the best system that I was aware of if I wanted to cultivate wisdom, for example. And so I took upon myself the rules of Theravada Buddhism because I adopted Theravada Buddhism and I didn't want to cheat and break the rules. Also, part of my reasoning when I was a junior monk was you've got like the trinity of Sila, Samadhi, Panya, which is morality, concentration, and wisdom. And as a junior monk especially, I didn't think that my concentration was very good. I didn't consider my wisdom to be adequate, and there wasn't a whole hell of a lot I could have done about it, immediately in those two cases. But the Sila part, the morality part, that I could nail that if I really set my heart to it. And so I just set down the task of just following Vinaya as well as I could. And what was I going to say? I had this thing I was going to say, and now it just escaped me. It just went in one ear and out the other. Well, I mean, in Buddhism, okay, I remember what I was going to say. That in Buddhism, I mean, you can't have purity of mind unless you have purity of sila. And one of the kinds of sila is Patimokkha Samvara Sila, which is restraint through following the Patimokkha, which would apply to all the Vinaya rules. It's a kind of self-restraint or samvara. So, I mean, there's numerous reasons why an ordained monk would follow the rules of his order. Just to be ordained and then just break the rules and just decide which rules you're going to follow and which rules you're not going to follow. I mean, it's going about it in a very half-assed way. It's a way that's very common in the West now. I mean, look at how Christians conduct their lives. They don't even really think about it because it's just been built into Christianity in the West for many decades, that even though Jesus says you can't get divorced and remarry, people just go ahead and do it, including like pastors and ministers and so forth. The Bible says, gather not up your treasures upon the earth, and all the Christians out there, or most of them, are gathering up the treasures upon the earth. And I really have never been that kind of a religious person. If the religion says you have to do it this way, then you have to do it this way. If I were born a Jew, I'd have to be kosher, or else I would just renounce being a Jew, because being a half-assed Jew that's just flouting the Mosaic law, I mean, it's just kind of a dishonest life. And being a monk who's just flouting the Vinaya rules, that strikes me as living a rather dishonest life also. It's like a hypocritical kind of life. So, especially when I came to the West, and just following the Vinaya rules strictly it was almost a non-starter. I mean, there's very little support for that. That was one of the reasons why I just stopped being a monk. I'd rather be this a half-assed layperson than a half-assed monk. So I guess I answered that. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Tig. And Tig, who asked me about my favorite kind of soup in the previous Q&A, asked in this one, what is Burmese music like? And that's actually kind of an interesting question. I don't think I've answered that before. But there's different kinds of Burmese music, of course, just as there are different kinds of American music. But, I mean, mainly it would divide up into two categories. That is like classical, traditional, purely Burmese music. And then you've got Burmese kind of pop music that largely imitates Western pop music. Those are the two main kinds of music. And Western pop music, I mean, that also can be divided up into different kinds of like Burmese music imitating Western pop music. Some of the old-fashioned Burmese pop music, it's kind of like the music you'd hear on Sesame Street. You know, it's sort of like children's music. It kind of sounds that way to a Westerner, at least to this Westerner. And then, nevertheless, they do have some fairly good like rock and roll. It's just kind of sad to me to hear Burmese musicians rapping. You know, Burmese hip hop. You know, they'll just imitate. There's even like some Burmese country western music that you can hear blasted over monastery loudspeakers out in the middle of nowhere. I remember one time, one of my earliest memories of Burma was it was one of my first alms rounds after getting to Chaltsin Doya. And so you have this long line of monks walking single file on this crooked path, just kind of weaving through the fields, like the sesamum fields. It wasn't enough rain for rice there. And we walked past this hut. It was just like a thatched roof hut. And it had like this palm tree next to it, a toddy palm. And about a third of the way up the toddy palm was this old beat up speaker. And playing on the speaker was a Burmese version of Walk Like an Egyptian by the Bangles. So all the monks are kind of walking quietly single file to da 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 dun dun da da dun dun da dun 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 dun. But Burmese classical music, if you want to get an idea of what Burmese classical music sounds like, you take like a wooden crate and you put some dishes and some pots and pans and a couple of live geese into this crate, and you close it, and then you shake it vigorously like this, and that sounds like Burmese classical music. And the classical dancing is you've got this woman dressed like a pretty girl dressed in like 19th century court attire with like the long train like behind her skirt and everything, and then she just alternately rolls around on the floor and like gets up and jumps around in a circle, like flapping her arms like wings, and just it's just kind of, it's hard for a Westerner to appreciate this kind of performance art. But even though, to me, Burmese classical music always did sound like the crate with the pots and pans and dishes and two live geese shaken vigorously, I did have a Canadian monk who had like an orchestra conductor for a brother. He was really into music, and he was telling me that some of that Burmese classical music is really advanced. You know, it gets it up into the level of like really advanced jazz music in the West, and like really complex rhythms and so forth. And it may be that I just never trained my ear well enough to pick out the really advanced rhythms and so forth, because it really does just sound like a box full of pots, pans, dishes, and geese that are just being shaken vigorously. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. And this is the last question. It always takes me by surprise. By golly. And this question is from Wayne. And Wayne says, is fourth jhana nibbana, or simply a stepping stone to nibbana? The way I understand it is, jhana has an important role in calming the mind to temporarily suppress the five hindrances for wisdom and insight to arise. Once out of jhana, one has a better chance to contemplate the three marks of existence, anicca, dukkha, and anatta, and through the practice of the Four Noble Truths, not easy, but one can work on distinguishing the three poisons of greed, hate, and delusion for the final attainment. When the Buddha entered into parinibbana, was he not in fourth jhana? Comments, please and thank you. Well, no, fourth jhana is not the same as nibbana. Jhana in general is referred to as temporary liberation, which is different from permanent liberation, which is enlightenment. So fourth jhana, it kind of gives you a little taste of what nibbana would be like, because it's like with fourth jhana especially, you are completely stilling the mind. Your mind is just like quiet and calm and clear, and you're not experiencing mental or physical pleasure or pain. That you're no longer thinking, you no longer really have a primary object of meditation, although that probably is not orthodox, that last thing that I just said. But your mind is just like clear like glass, let's say. And it's temporary. It has a beginning and an end. It has a cause, so it is a conditioned state. And that reminds me of one of my favorite suttas in the Majjhima Nikaya, which is the Lesser Discourse on Voidness, where it gives instructions on for a monk how to cultivate voidness, or sunyata. And first step is you just leave town, you leave the village, and you go out into a forest. And then that is relatively more empty or void than all the commotion going on in a town or village. And then you start meditating on, some meditation object, and you get into deeper and deeper states. You get into jhana, you master all the 4 jhanas. And then it even mentions a state that's supposedly above jhana, which is the signless concentration of mind, which is the animita chitta samadhi, which, it's even higher than 4th jhana. But then the monk, when he comes out of that state, he realizes, that had a beginning and an end. That was a conditioned state with causes and so forth. And so even the highest possible meditative state is not enlightenment. And then that causes a kind of click. It causes liberating insight to arise. So after liberating insight has arisen, then even when your mind is still thinking and everything, then you're still enlightened. It doesn't go away. So I've tried to explain this in various ways in the past, where it's like consciousness is like water, and mental states like perceptions are like the waves on the surface of that water. And so most people are just stuck identifying with the waves, the forms, rather than the essence. So they're just stuck at the level of form. They're just completely caught up in distinguishing waves, and I prefer this wave to that wave, and this wave is way better than that wave, and just it's all waves. But if you cultivate a flat calm through meditation, which would be like jhana, then it's much more difficult to be distracted by the waves, because there aren't any waves, or the waves just become so subtle that it's easy not to be distracted by them. And then you see the essence of water. You start seeing it as water. So even when the waves come back after you're done meditating, then you can still, if you're enlightened, then it's still, you're just not distracted by the forms that the water is taking. It's just water. And then the waves can come back and have stormy seas even, and it doesn't matter, because you're no longer distracted by the forms that the water is taking. It's the essence of water, so to speak. That's kind of like, an analogy. So I forgot even what the question was here. Is 4th jhana nibbana, or simply a stepping stone to nibbana? Well, yeah, it can be a stepping stone to nibbana. Not necessarily, but it can be. Some of the old Buddhist texts do consider like 4th jhana to be the jumping off point to enlightenment, although it doesn't necessarily work that way. It may be that some people can see the essence of water and not be distracted by the waves, even when there's waves. They don't have to completely eliminate the waves temporarily in order to go beyond this attachment to the forms, and just get to the essence or substance of the water, and just see the water as water. so to speak. So it is true. There's another question here. When the Buddha entered into Parinibbana, was he not in fourth jhana? Yeah, that's like when the Buddha died in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, it has him going through the various stages of jhana. He goes through first, he goes into first jhana, and then second jhana, then third jhana, then fourth jhana. Then he goes through the formless jhanas, and then he comes all the way back to first jhana, and then he goes up to fourth jhana again, and then dies or attains parinibbana while he's in fourth jhana. And I've considered that to be a little bit of evidence that the formless jhanas were not original to the teachings of the Buddha. I did write an essay on that probably isn't online anymore. But, the tradition was that he died in the highest jhana, which at the time was fourth jhana, but then just the Indian mind works this way, where it's continually trying to one-up the absolute. Like even some Upanishadic texts appear to say, well, there's a stage that's even higher than Brahman. It's para Brahman. So the Indians were always trying to come up with something that's even higher than what most people consider to be the absolute. Just to say, well, you think that's the absolute, but we got this one that's even higher. But I do think that originally fourth jhana was the highest meditative state possible. But it was a meditative state. It had a beginning and an end. It was conditioned. And anything that has a beginning also has an end. So, it's very different. Jhana is like a samsaric state, and nibbana is just transcending samsara. And that's the last question, and I'm done. Except for the outro, where I say the usual stuff about if you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the comments below. Or if you have access to Subscribestar, you can ask there. If you have access to the Discord server, you can ask there. And any question that you think is fair game, that you think I might actually be able to answer. And I'm fairly good at answering questions about Buddhism, about philosophy in general, about religion in general, although some religions like Baha'i I know very little about. But Christianity I know quite a lot about. Buddhism, of course, I know quite a lot about. Hinduism I know something about, etc. And just monasticism, rules of monastic discipline, that sort of thing, I know something about. Burma, I lived there for 24 years approximately. Me personally, I've been me personally for 60 years at this point. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask. And if you like the video, you might as well click the like button. And if you want to hear more of this stuff, then subscribing would be a nice thing to do also. So I guess that's it. And so I'm just going to stop recording now by clicking on this.